When you're in danger, take a look all around, and I'll be there. I'm sorry, but I'm just thinking of the right words to say. Promise. I know they don't sound the way I planned them to be. Promise. But if you wait around a while.
I give the CIA a total credit for sponsoring and initiating the entire consciousness movement, counterculture events of the 1960s.
Explore the moon, the planets, and the interplanetary environment of our solar system. To investigate the sun and its relationship to Earth, the geophysical properties of the Earth, and the physical nature of the universe. To determine the biological effects of the space environment on Earth life form, and to search for and analyze extraterrestrial life. To develop experiments for manned space flight, which use the special capabilities of a trained astronaut as a sensor, manipulator, and evaluator. Provide pre-doctoral training for scientists and engineers, and grants for space science research projects and laboratory facilities to best use university resources for the national space effort. To develop and manage launch vehicles, on which reliable
Welcome back to another episode of Rise to Liberty. We have a very special show for you today. Today's guest is Justin of at LDS Abuse on X. And do you have any other social medias?
I don't. I used to have a website, but I had to let it go, and I exclusively hang out on X these days. So.
All right. Well, make sure and go check him out on X. We will make sure that his profile is linked in the episode description, along with some other interesting posts from him that I think people would also be interested in. So I guess let's just dive straight into it. And first of all, who are you and where did you kind of start your journey on this?
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, so my name is Justin Riggs. I was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormons, for 45 years, up until about 2 years ago now. I was excommunicated from the church for apostasy, largely for not sustaining the brethren, is the terminology that they would use, because I was studying the topic of abuse in the church. And talking a lot about it, amongst other things. It's a fairly complex story. We could probably spend 2 hours, hour and a half talking just about that. But the long and short of it was, I was eventually excommunicated, but I've continued to do my research, and it's really become a big part of my life's purpose. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here today to discuss some of the things that we found. So.
Yeah, of course. You were always more than welcome on this platform, or any platform, that I have say over. And with that, I guess the biggest question is, at least here in the beginning, is why would the church care so much about you looking into the cases of abuse, or their response to abuse cases?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's really interesting, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today, is that exact question of how did we get here, right? a lot of people around me want to talk about satanic ritual abuse, and I think that's great. I think we need to be talking about it. I think we need to be talking about the Pace memo. But when you just introduce that to people, especially to members of the church, it's just too far of a bridge to cross, right? Yeah. And so what people don't understand, and what I want to talk about today is how did we get here to this place where a corporation that took upon itself the name of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So there's these two entities, one that it's a spiritual body called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, one that's a corporation that's known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. How did this corporation take over and, in my opinion, sort of drain the spiritual body of its lifeblood and just take over? And of course, it's just a corporation like any other corporation. And what do corporations care about the most? Their image, their brand, right? And their assets. Right. And so somebody studying what I'm studying, abuse, especially, again, just in my opinion, with the church's lack of effective prevention and response in the abuse space, it hurts their brand, right? And then the more people, one of the things I'm really proud of is the more that we talk, the more people come forward. And of course, the more people that come forward, the more the church's assets are at risk, right? Because we know that the church is willing to pay out if the case, merits it. And so, so I am just sort of in the way of this corporation being who they want to be to the world, and I interfere with their messaging, and so I think that, and particularly because we study a lot about some of the leadership of the church and have found some interesting cases of not like, we have to decide what abuse is, right? But like, just as a, for example, just very recently, we found out that there was a story about Russell M. Nelson who had lied to Sherry Dew about a story called the Hat Lady story. And it was this faith promoting miracle story that Russell Nelson told Sherry Dew, and she was going to publish it in a biography. Right. Well, a member of the family read that story and said, like, you can't publish that. It's materially incorrect in the facts. And so, we've been pressing on that. And fortunately, we were able to get Fair LDS to pull down the content that they had on their criticisms of Russell M. Nelson page to do a review on what they had published, because we believe that some of the things, we believe, A, that they've published some things that aren't true, and B, they've withheld some things on that page that probably should be on that page. Right. And so it's not abuse in the sense of physical or whatever, but when you're the leader of a global church and you decide that you're going to lie to that group of people, I consider that abusive, right? Right. It really can mentally mess with people if they trust somebody like that and then find out that they're following or sustaining somebody who claims that you can trust him completely. Russell Nelson is on the record multiple times stating that he's one of 15 men before he died, that he was one of 15 men that you can trust completely. And so it really messes with people's minds when you hear that, find out that he's lying to you, right? Right. Yeah.
So I guess, because I'm sure at some point, there's going to be some current LDS members that are going to come across this or whatever. I guess the question before we just dive into this story is, do you feel, at least at this point, that you would probably still be a member if you were not excommunicated?
Yeah, I believe I would be. Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a household that allowed for questioning, and I'm just a naturally curious person. Right. Much of the things that, like, I had my faith crisis probably 15 years ago, like my most, serious faith crisis. And once I worked through that, I just decided that it wasn't the men that mattered. Like, Mormonism is the water that I swam in, and it's the only thing that I know. And so I think there's very little doubt that if I hadn't been excommunicated, that I would still be a member. And I never encourage anybody to leave the church. I think one of the things, I get criticized for this rightfully, that I spend a lot of time hammering away at the faults of the church and its leadership. But the truth is that there are millions and millions of good people in the spiritual body, right? That are very Christian in the way that they do things. They'll bake you cookies. They'll come and watch your kids when you're having a baby. They'll come over to your house and help you clean up your yard after a storm. Like really good people trying to do really good things. And the community in a Mormon ward is second to none in a lot of places.
Right.
So I would never encourage anybody to leave just for the heck of it. I mean, everybody has to make their own personal decisions about that. But I think there are a lot of really great things about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, particularly the spiritual body, not so much the corporation.
Right. And that I would have to 100% agree with. That's kind of always the caveat that I kind of bring to these types of conversations, especially being a resident of Utah, like there's just so many good people everywhere, all over the place that would give you the shirt off their back.
Yeah.
There's also some not so great people, but
right.
There's still like such a congregation of just like really great, solid people. And you would honestly probably never even know that they were LDS members unless you asked or they told you, and they probably aren't going to tell you. They're just going to want to help, Yeah,
you bet. So. You bet. Yeah. My big concern for members of the church is what I would just call like naivete, especially about historical matters. Right. Growing up in the church, when they made the decision to correlate all the curriculum, every member of the church around the world gets fed the same diet of what I would consider whitewashed history that, again, is all designed to center around the brand that the corporation wants to project. Right. And, we don't need to get too doctrinal here, but like, in the church, you learn that faith is a belief in things that are true, but can't be seen. So like, you can't have faith about things that aren't true, right? It's just not possible. Definitionally, it's not possible. And so I'm very concerned that people have put their faith in the wrong place. And I personally have a lot of faith in the members of the church that they can handle the truth about their history. And so a lot of what I do and a lot of what I want to talk about today is what is that true history? Like, what really happened that led us to this point where the corporation will do just about anything to protect their image and assets when a case of abuse comes up inside of the church, right? Because it was just so, it was so confusing to me. Like, I was involved in a couple abuse cases as a ward clerk, and then just in my own personal life. And I could not square the circle about how could these people that I knew were so wonderful because I had lived amongst them and served with them and been served by them, how could, like, as soon as abuse came up, something switched. And all of a sudden it became about protecting the bishop, protecting the church, but like the one thing that like, it's not like we never talked about protecting the victim, but that was like secondary or tertiary to, and it was so confusing to me. And so, and that's, again, like one of my major purposes is when somebody goes through abuse in the church, they often end up extremely confused because they go to the church thinking that they're going to be treated as a child of God because that's the messaging. What they end up being treated as is like an HR problem. Right. And that's incredibly discombobulating to a human being. And it really re-traumatizes them and creates what I call, not me, but like in the abuse community, they call it the second wound. So you get abused, that's the first wound. Then you go to get help and you don't get the support that you want or need. And that's the second wound. And so people are so confused. So a lot of what I'm doing is trying to help people understand that they're not crazy. Right. Because they walk away from these experiences feeling like they're crazy because these people that they trusted and that are in authority for their whole life turned into something that they didn't recognize all of a sudden. And they're just wandering, just trying to survive. And sometimes trying to stay alive, And so I think this history and this understanding of the corporate structure versus the spiritual body really helps people feel less crazy because things are pretty explainable when you understand what really happened in history and who's in charge of the spiritual body, right? Which is completely been subsumed by the corporation. Right.
So I think that's a beautiful opening to all of this. And so let's just jump all the way back.
Sure.
And you were mentioning earlier, you wanted to kind of start with Brigham Young.
Yeah.
And I agree. I think that's a great starting point. So what exactly, why are we jumping that far back? And what is it that we need to jump that far back for?
Yeah. So for me, it's really critical. Like in the church, one of the things that I was always very interested in is the church's idea of building Zion. You hear about it all the time, right? That is like the main purpose of the church is to build Zion. And yet here we are almost 200 and whatever years into this experiment. And we've according to the Mormons, they've never built Zion, nor have they apostatized, which is kind of a weird claim, right? Like,
right.
if you read your scriptures in the church, there's really no society that can claim to have existed for that long without achieving one or the other, outside of maybe Enoch's Zion, right? And so for me, where I wanted to pick up my research was at the succession crisis, right? Like, I'm just going to give the Mormon church, Joseph Smith, and all of those experiences as like axiomatically, like, not open to scrutiny in my research, right? Like, obviously it's very open and there's a lot to discuss there. People spend their whole life studying Joseph Smith and that kind of thing. So it's not that it's not worth looking at. For me, I wanted to start at the succession crisis. And how did Brigham Young take power? And what did he do after he took power, especially, right? And so, I mean, the thing that's so interesting to me about that is that, you know, in the church, you hear that the church fled Illinois because of persecution and because they wanted to go find a place where they could build Zion. But one of the very first things that I found in my research was that, Brigham Young had just been indicted, right, amongst many other church leaders. And there's something I just want to point out really quickly. I'm going to present a lot of facts that are really well documented. And usually I do a presentation where I show the documents on the screen. And tonight we're not going to do that. But I want to just point out that, like, reasonable people can look at the same set of facts and draw different conclusions. So I'm not here to say that my interpretation of the facts is necessarily true. And I just love having the discussion. That's why I'm so grateful to be here tonight, right?
Right.
So, but like, when I look at Brigham Young, my interpretation of it is this. If you're going halfway across the country to build Zion, it doesn't make any sense to me that one of the first things you would do when you got to Utah would be to build a railroad through your backyard that gave Babylon access to your quote unquote Zion. So that was just a confusing thing to me. And when I get confused, I like to research and I like to study. And sure enough, one thing that we found is that you can find Brigham Young stating very explicitly that something along the lines of, we hadn't crossed the Missouri more than one day before we started looking for a way to build a railroad from the east to the west, right?
Right.
So it clearly shows you that whatever else was going on with Brigham Young and these other guys that took the saints across the plains, it wasn't just about building Zion, right? Because they knew that they were going to build this railroad, and Brigham, I think, knew that it was going to enrich him, which it did, you know, on the backs of the Mormon people, which we'll talk a little bit more about how that sort of happened. But so for me, that's why I like to start with Brigham Young, because if the church is going to claim that they want to build Zion, then the purpose of the system is what it does. And it just doesn't look to me like that the system was designed to build Zion. It looks like it was designed to enrich a small group of men at the expense of a large group of people. And I think history bears out that that's exactly what happened.
Right. And so is this, do you at least believe, in your opinion, that this was coming from Brigham Young, or do you think it was kind of like him plus a bunch of other people? Like, I guess what I'm asking is he the tip of the spear? You know, is he the one kind of, I mean, obviously he ended up being the prophet and coming out and is this massive figure here in Utah and of course to the rest of the LDS faith throughout the world. But like, is he that tip of the spear? Is he the one pulling the strings and calling the shots?
Yeah. I mean, so there's a lot of conjecture out there in sort of the LDS conspiracy community. And so, like, I don't know. I mean, here's what I'll say. The more that I look at it, the more it seems clear that however Mormonism came into existence and sprang into existence, it was very clearly infiltrated early on by Freemasonry, right? During Joseph's time. So we can take a step back into that. We know that Brigham was a Freemason. The very first picture we have of Brigham, he's wearing a Mason pin on his lapel, right? And so that's another thing that's just weird, right? Like, after sort of insinuating that Joseph was killed by a mob full of Masons, Brigham didn't seem all that upset about repping the merch, right? Kind of a thing. And so that's odd to me. But so, like, in terms of the tip of the spear, like, there's this whole thing about, like, you know, British Zionism, right? And like, that's a very interesting area of research. Like, we found genealogical charts that show very clearly that many of these early Mormon leaders believe that they descended straight through the Davidic line, right? And so there's that going on. And I guess theoretically, it could have been that these guys thought they had the divine right to rule through their bloodline. And I'll tell you the three people that are most important to me in terms of the history is it looks like Brigham Young, Heber Kimball, and Jedediah Grant really pulled off this succession crisis, and they consolidated power and then went through a reformation. Like, I don't think most Mormons even realize this. Like, there was a Mormon reformation of the church, right? Reformation is reformation, right? So they talk a lot about restoration, but after the restoration, there was a reformation. And what do we do with that, right? And basically, they just didn't believe that people were orthodox enough, and they definitely wanted polygamy to be a part of this. And so a lot of people got rebaptized. It was almost like a whole new church when Brigham took it over, right? You got blood atonement, you got Adam God, right? You got all these things that Joseph never spoke openly about, and Brigham sort of, again, insinuating or sometimes saying outright that he learned these things from Joseph, but we have no sources to support that. And a lot of the things that Brigham taught have been repudiated by the church lately in the last few years. So, I look at that, and the interesting part of the story for me is, Brigham, it seems, wanted one of Joseph's heirs to come and take over the church at some point. He, pretty openly claimed that he wasn't like the legal heir to leading the church. And so he was just holding it in conservatorship until somebody from Joseph's line could come and take it back. Unfortunately, Emma and all of her family wanted nothing to do with Brigham. It was very bitter, and they just didn't like each other at all. Brigham called Emma like one of the wickedest women on earth.
Oops.
Yeah, that's okay.
Sorry about that.
No, it's all right. So there's just, there you go. Yeah, you got the Freemason pin. That's awesome. Yeah. So unfortunately for Brigham and Heber and Jedediah, they had to figure out, like, they didn't want there to be another succession crisis, right? Right. And so, in my opinion, what it looks like to me is that they identified Heber J. Grant as a future prophet. So you can find stories very easily of Heber Kimball prophesying when Heber Grant was a very young child, placing him onto a table and prophesying that he would one day be a prophet in the church. And, what Heber J. Grant says about it is interesting to me. He says, the only thing I remember about that is that Heber Kimball had the blackest eyes I've ever seen, which I find interesting, right?
Yeah, right. That is interesting.
So the other thing about it is that Heber J. Grant had no interest in being a religious leader. Heber J. Grant was very, very interested in making money and being a business owner, right? And he worked for a future vice president of Wells Fargo who moved out to California. And he was very, very involved in everything commercial inside of Utah. In fact, they called him on multiple missions just to raise funds, because going back to the railroad story, as everybody knows, they were successful. They built the Transcontinental Railroad. They drove in the Golden Spike. But then, unfortunately, Union Pacific did not pay them like they were supposed to. So Brigham got his money, but Brigham wasn't able to pay a lot of the people that had done the actual work. And then there was a financial crisis, and the leaders of the church and the church itself were highly leveraged. And so they found themselves in real financial trouble, to the point where you can find in like general conferences, you can find George Q. Cannon saying the leading men of this church are so far in debt that we will never find a way out of it, right? And that's where they decided to get into the sugar industry, right? By growing beet sugar.
Yeah, sugar beets.
Yeah.
It's still massive today.
Exactly. Yeah. So their first introduction to sort of the corridors of power was through the railroad, because they're in with the Stanford family from the West, right? They're in with all the Union Pacific guys, who ends up being, like, not at that time, but a little bit later, it's the Harrimans who flow down into the bushes, right? Who were funding both sides of the world wars. And the church found a place inside of that, where Brigham Young was on the board of directors of Union Pacific. And since the time of Brigham Young, the church has been very well represented on the board of Union Pacific, including our current prophet, or the current prophet of the church. I guess I can't say "our" anymore, but Dallin H. Oaks, who served on that board of directors for a couple of years, or a year, or something like that. So the church found itself in the corridors of power through the railroad. Then they went through the financial crisis and decided to go on sugar. And Wilford Woodruff said very explicitly, like, we will build the sugar factory even if it bursts the church. That's his quote. And for a person like me, I look at what happened in history, and I think he was serious. I think that he understood like the potential consequences, because in order to get into the sugar industry, they had to raise capital. So again, you'll find in George Buchanan's journals a lot of him talking with Heber J. Grant and other leaders of the church about going back east to procure capital so that they could enter into the sugar market. And luckily for them, I guess, for those leaders, like they were able to find some investors who were very interested in having a workforce that was very compliant with authority and was known for their industry.
Right.
So the family that they ended up, amongst others, but the biggest family that they ended up basically selling the saints into bondage with were the Havermeyers. Okay. And so a lot of people don't know about the Havermeyer family, but it's very much like there was the oil trust, which everybody knows about, and there was the steel trust, which everybody knows about. Most people don't know about the sugar trust, but it's part of that milieu of time where the Havermeyers were the key players in the sugar industry, and they decided to invest basically in the church as a corporate entity, right? And the brethren were more than happy to rid themselves of the debt that they had found themselves in and sell their people into what I would consider sort of a soft form of slavery, right?
Right.
And again, like you'll find Heber J. Grant in General Conference several years after they started in the sugar beet factory, and he says, Wilford Woodruff said that we would build it if it burst the church, but it didn't burst the church. Instead, it's made us millions and millions of dollars. And I imagine, I don't have the ability to do the math and find the records here, but I would imagine over the years that they have been involved in that they've made billions of dollars, right? Billions and billions of dollars. The trust got so bad that, I'm going to forget the acronym of the government agency. Is it the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission? Had just been formed. Yeah, I think that's who it is. They had just been formed, and one of the first things they did was try to break up the sugar trust. And they found that the church was engaged in all manner of immoral, unethical, and illegal activity as part of the sugar trust, and went to go break it up, right? Now, to be fair, if you tell a member of the church who knows about their history about this, they'll say, well, eventually later on, Congress overrode a lot of what the FTC had found. The thing that people need to understand is the FTC was brand new. It was a baby inside of the government. And there were a lot of powerful interests who did not want these trusts to be broken up. And so it makes a lot of sense that some of these findings got reversed and so on and so forth. But I personally believe that what the FTC found was accurate and true. I think the church was involved in like all kinds of immoral and unethical and illegal activity to keep competitors out of the sugar industry, particularly in the West. Right. Yeah. And so, yeah, there's our guy, Havermeyer. So you get through the railroads, you get through the sugar, and eventually the sugar thing, kind of winds itself up, but they now have access to like all kinds of power structures, right? Especially sort of what I would consider the aristocracy of the church. This is the time frame when the Canons and the Tanners and a bunch of these other families like John A. Widtsoe, they decide that they want to send their children back east to go to school because that's where the good schools are. That's where the Ivy League schools are.
Right.
And so there's sort of this internal battle in the church between orthodoxy and secularization, right? And you can find people arguing about the benefits of both of these, but clearly the side that believed in secularization and specifically about statehood, right? That's sort of the same group. And so that group of people who wanted to secularize and get statehood eventually won this battle. And the cost of winning that battle was the loss of polygamy, right? The new and everlasting covenant. And that caused another huge schism inside of the church that to this day, the consequences of that are playing out, as we all know, right? And so we won't go too far into that. We'll sort of stick with the Brighamites, or what I like to call the Grantites, because when you look at the legacy, like a lot of the leadership flow through Heber J. Grant. So I think it's more of a Grantite church than a Brighamite church at this point, including in the philosophy of the church. Like we mentioned, that Heber J. Grant was into commercialism. And that's really the direction the church took. Like they were tired of being persecuted. They were tired of being poor. And so they decided to make some compromises so that they wouldn't have to deal with those trials anymore. Right.
Now, one thing I know that my audience is going to want to know. So before we get too far, what is the importance of Brigham Young being a Freemason? Like, why does that matter?
Yeah, well, sure. So look, there are a lot of people who are way more knowledgeable about Freemasonry than me, right? So I think the important thing here to note is just simply this, like Freemasonry very strongly influenced the temple endowment. And there's a lot of confusion about how that happened. And there's a lot of confusion about why that happened. But it's really undeniable that it did happen, right?
Right.
And so like this idea that potentially the church was infiltrated by Freemasonry and that it's been influenced by that influence, that secret society, what I would consider a secret society, it bothers people. The thing about that is, again, going back to Joseph Smith, is that Joseph Smith came from a family that was involved in Freemasonry and what they call folk magic, right? What the church will call folk magic. I think it was probably something a little bit different than folk magic personally. But this idea that Freemasons infiltrated the church very early on, and that since that time, it's really been sort of Freemasonic theater or Masonic theater from that point forward, I think is what's important to understand, right?
Right. And so this would be an outside influence that really isn't with the ideals of the church in the first place, because they have their own thing going on.
Sure.
So regardless of if they are, benevolent or not, is kind of irrelevant, because it's still another organization that has their own set of goals and their own set of principles and everything
Sure.
that influenced it.
So, and beyond that, I mean, you and I both know that in the Temple Recommend interview, as it evolved, which it has, one of the questions became, do you affiliate with or support any individual or group who has practices or teachings that are against the teachings of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? And certainly Freemasonry falls into that, right?
Right.
So, I mean, it's very difficult to know and understand what happened there. I mean, there was certainly like a lot of controversy between the Masons and the Mormons. There wasn't a lot of Masonry in Utah. Like for decades and decades, Masons didn't want to deal with Mormons because of what happened in Nauvoo. The Nauvoo Freemasonry was really out of control, right? With people showing up one day and being elevated to the highest ranks of Freemasonry within days. And I think it really kind of freaked the Masons out a little bit, right?
Right.
So there was this really uneasy sort of Cold War, I guess you could call it, between them. But again, you got Brigham wearing his pin like during that time, right? So like, I don't think we really know the whole story there. I really don't.
Right.
But I like, to your point, I think it's dead on, which is simply this. Whatever you believe about Freemasonry and whatever you believe about Mormonism, what we can say conclusively is that they don't have the same teachings and philosophies. And so to mix them is sort of a weird thing, right?
Right.
So, and what ends up happening, to move forward in the chronology here a little bit, is that eventually that Cold War thaws, and it really thaws through Rotary International, which I know sounds very weird. And like, it was very strange how this all came about. Like, I was on Twitter and some account, I believe it's Deny the Mark 2020, if I remember right, just happened to mention Rotary International in my feed. And I thought, okay, well, like, let me just go look at this. And it turned out to be one of the richest veins of information in the research that I've done. I honestly couldn't believe it. Every single major church leader has been affiliated with or supported Rotary International. Not only that, but Mormons have had 2 presidents of Rotary International, one of which was a general authority in the church, given the explicit blessing to be the president of Rotary International. That was David O. McKay. And David O. McKay even went so far as to say the purposes of Rotary International are congruent with the purposes of the LDS Church, which again, I would really question, right? Personally. This mixing of commerce and theology, is very strange to me. So the thing about that, though, is that it opened up, Rotary International really centers around this idea of bringing together people of different backgrounds, including different religions and different organizations. So that thawing between members of the church and Freemasons, right, and other groups of people, other religions. Like there are a lot of very powerful, prominent members of other religions. The Catholics have a very strong presence in Salt Lake City, right? And so as they did this, and sort of allowed themselves to, like, so from my position, again, this is where two people can look at the same set of facts and draw different conclusions. My conclusion is that this was a group of men who really wanted to serve two masters, right? I think they were very sincere about wanting to serve Jesus Christ. There are a lot of people around me who want me to say that the leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ have bad intent, that they have evil intent.
Right.
And I'm just not at a place where I'm ready to say that, right? What I look at is I see very sincere but very deluded men. And we have to take a step backwards, actually, to talk about this, because they didn't just get into Rotary International out of nowhere. There was actually some things going on at the University of Utah that led them to have access to Rotary International, okay? So what was happening at the University of Utah was John A. Widtsoe testifies that while in a book called In a Sunlit Land that he wrote, that when he was president of the university, he overheard two non-member members of the Board of Regents discussing the conspiracy to overthrow the state of Utah and the University of Utah by diluting the teachings of the church and pulling the youth of the church away from Mormonism, right? So not only do we have that witness from John Widtsoe, but in General Conference, there was actually an epistle written by the First Presidency and read in General Conference that talked about the conspiracy that had been laid to overthrow the state of Utah. Now, for people who aren't members of the church, and even for members of the church, I don't think they understand like the importance of that that epistle. So you have to remember, like when you're reading the New Testament, what are you reading? You're reading the epistles of Paul written to the church. So it's scripture, right?
Right.
So although this epistle didn't get canonized, it's about the closest thing that you're going to find to scripture in the LDS church. And it's very open about this idea that church leaders believed there was a conspiracy to overthrow the state of Utah by diluting the teachings of Mormonism, right? So to me, then, the open question is, well, the only open question is, did the conspirators succeed? And I think if you look at it, they did. And the way that they did that was through the Greek living system at the University of Utah, right? And what they would do is, just like every fraternity everywhere, they would take young men and young women, fraternities and sororities that maybe, I mean, I don't know how to talk about this because I always get in trouble because I always get comments afterwards of, my grandpa was a member of a fraternity and he was a great guy. And my grandma was a member of a sorority, to which I say, yes, of course. I am not talking about every fraternity member or every sorority member, just like I'm not talking about every church member when I talk about poor abuse prevention and response, right?
Yeah, that's too much of an absolute statement to make, to say every single person. That's
right.
Then that sort of discussion doesn't fly on this channel. So
yeah. So here's how I look at it, okay? Fraternities and sororities are a great funnel, right? You're going to get a certain kind of person who wants to be a part of a fraternity or a part of sorority, generally speaking, right? And they have a few goals, right? They want to be a part of something where they'll have a great network, right? They want to be a part of something that they can have a lot of fun, and they want to be a part of something where they're going to have access to members of the opposite sex, if we're just being honest about it, right?
Right.
So it's a great funnel because you get a fairly prestigious, often like well-heeled, rich conglomerate of people. And then I think of fraternities like Sigma Chi and Pi Kappa Alpha and Beta Epsilon, Theta, whatever they are. I think of those as like the minor leagues, right? And what they're doing inside of the minor leagues is they're just looking to identify who should be in the major leagues, right? Just like any farm system.
Right.
Okay. And at the University of Utah, it's really clear that that farm system was feeding into Skull and Bones. And then in the senior year, was Owl and Key. And we're going to talk a little bit about this because there's some confusion around it. But if you just think of it as a farm system, it makes a lot of sense, right? And what you'll find is we've mapped every member of fraternities at the University of Utah from about 1909 through 1970 when they stopped publishing the information in the Utonian. And what you'll find is that, I mean, it's very clear that Sigma Chi and Pi Kappa Alpha were the two biggest fraternities, the two most powerful fraternities, and they had a power sharing agreement in which they would each get about the same number of Skull and Bones members every year, and then they would leave the breadcrumbs for the rest of the fraternities. And so you'll see a few people scattered in, and then Skull and Bones would also pick like the best athlete, right, at the school that year, and they would pull that person in, right? And so, but all you're doing is you're just creating a place where people can build a network to set themselves up for success, and a place where they can access power, influence, and gain moving forward after their college careers. And it's very clear when you look at the roster of people who are in Skull and Bones, and Allen Key, and Beehive is another one. But like when you look at those people, like it's very clear that they were just working their way through the farm system, and these were the ones that were identified and picked out, right, to be put into positions of power, influence, and gain in business, government, and inside the ecclesiastical structure of the Mormon Church. Okay. Now, I imagine your audience wants to know, like the first question I always get is it Yale Skull and Bones, right? And the answer to that is yes. Okay. So we know that the University of Utah Skull and Bones chapter was founded by Roddy Jules.
Yeah. Hey Dana.
one of my best friends on Twitter. I miss her. Good to see her. So anyway, the question is really like, when Skull and Bones is founded, it's founded by a Yale Bonesman. Okay. Not only that, but the Skull and Bones, the United States president, who I'm going to get his name is Taft, William Howard Taft, is visiting Utah multiple times right around the time that this gets going. Okay. Not only that, but there was an entire Skull and Bones alumni association in Salt Lake City with over a dozen bonesmen there in Salt Lake. And people ask, well, why? Like, why would Yale want to set up a second chapter of Skull and Bones in Utah?
I still ask that question.
Yeah, well, so
Yeah.
I think it makes a lot of sense. So like, if you look at a map of railroads, if you look at a map of telecommunications, if you look at anything that's commercial, what you'll see is that Salt Lake is a way station between Chicago and San Francisco, right?
100%. I mean, they still call, Utah the gateway to the West.
That's right. And so like, I think that as things were progressing and as this manifest destiny was rolling across the nation, I think that back east, they just looked at it and said, where are we going to set up shop on the West, right? And they already had San Francisco, but they needed somewhere in between, right? And I think that it ended up that Salt Lake was that place. So now it does get interesting. And I'm actually going on a show next Tuesday, I believe, with Ben McClintock of Liberty Tree Society. And we're going to talk about the Skull and Bones at University of Utah, because for a long time, I fell into a trap that a lot of Mormons fall into, which is I believed the prophet. And Russell M. Nelson, in his autobiography, stated that he was a member of Skull and Bones. And I just took him for his word, which is never a great idea, right? And I really learned a lesson here, because I jumped all over that. And I found every rotten thing about Skull and Bones at the University of Utah that you can find, which there are many. When it started, it was very clearly like the Yale Skull and Bones. They were choosing 15 men at a time. They were doing their initiations in a cave just east of the university. They had Skull and Bones pins that had like red, ruby eyes, whatever. They describe it in the newspaper, right? They had goats. They made the goats do all the things that you can imagine that goats do when they're being initiated into a secret society like Skull and Bones. So it's very, very much like that. Now, it got to a point where I can't remember exactly what triggered it, but somebody said something to me, and it really made me realize that I needed to do my due diligence and look at the entirety of Skull and Bones history versus just the bad things that I had found.
Right.
And this really interesting thing happened, okay? So in the 1930s, there was an abuse scandal. So we know that the Skull and Bones members were doing the paddling thing. They were abusing the initiates. And one group of initiates stood up for themselves and said, we are not going to take this. And the members of Allen Key, the senior class that choose the members of Skull and Bones, said, yeah, no, you're going to do it, or we're going to find a new group of people to put in here. So that group of initiates capitulated and allowed themselves to be abused. But the next year, when they were Allen Key, they got rid of like all the dressing up and all the things. And this strange thing that happens, because the University of Utah Skull and Bones chapter almost becomes like a Mickey Mouse Club. Okay, it's still the highest, most prestigious club on campus, but it seems to me from the newspaper record and from the yearbook record that it starts dying on the vine. Okay,
Right.
to the point where the years that Russell M. Nelson is at the University of Utah, they are really struggling to find members. So the year after Russell M. Nelson was supposed to be Skull and Bones, they only chose 2 people to be in Skull and Bones. It was almost dead. Okay. I'm going to go forward and then I'm going to come back. At some point, it gains strength again. And you can, yeah, that's actually the article right there. Is that the one that has the, no, that's not the one. You can find one where eventually it comes back and these guys show up to the interview with the school newspaper in death masks and black robes.
Oh, no.
Okay. They also have a picture on the side of the article that they provided to the newspaper that's chock full of symbolism, right? It's one of my favorite things to look at and talk about, but I just don't have it today. And so you can see that they kind of came back, you know, after this 1970 where they stopped publishing the names and it came back. But there's 2 things. It really did seem like it was almost dead at the University of Utah, even though it was the most prestigious honor and the most prestigious club. The other thing is that I am 99% convinced that Russell M. Nelson lied in his autobiography about being a member of Skull and Bones. And we don't have to go into all that evidence.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, it's so, if you want to go into it, we can, but if people want to learn more about that, again, I'm going to be debating this on like next Tuesday, going through all of the evidence. But basically, here's the thing. In the newspaper record, they write about when the deadline was for applications to be submitted. Then they published who was selected for all the years that Russell M. Nelson was there, and his name is never in the paper. Okay. His best friend and the vice president of Sigma Chi, the year that Russell Nelson was president, did get into Skull and Bones. Okay. But Russell M. Nelson did not. Okay. You can also look at the yearbook, and his picture is not in the yearbook for Skull and Bones. Okay. The one thing that really gets me is in his marriage announcement, he mentions every honor that he had received, which was a lot of honors. Russell M. Nelson was a very smart, very ambitious man, and he was a part of a lot of honorary societies. The one that he doesn't mention is Skull and Bones. And this is like months after he graduated from the University of Utah. When you go back and look at other members of the Skull and Bones and find their marriage announcements, they inevitably mention it because it was the most prestigious thing that you could do while at the University of Utah.
Right.
So the fact that he leaves that out tells me that he knew that if he tried to tell that lie at that time, he would have gotten caught with his pants down, right?
Right.
But if he's writing an autobiography that's only going to go to his family and he's a really prideful man, like what's the harm in telling a little lie? And I think his pride was hurt about not being selected for that. Now, people need to understand that he was selected for Owl and Key the next year. So the next question I always get is, well, don't you have to be a member of Skull and Bones to be a member of Owl and Key? And the answer to that is no. If you go through the newspaper record, you'll find that at some point, because these organizations were kind of dying on the vine, Owl and Key makes a very important decision that you don't have to be a member of Skull and Bones in order to be a member of Owl and Key. So
okay,
it's not a problem that Russell Nelson was a member of Owl and Key. And it's important to note that, like, for whatever reason that they didn't choose him for Skull and Bones, he was able to access those same networks of power, influence, and gain by getting into Owl and Key, right?
Right.
So whether he was a member of Skull and Bones or not, he's clearly in the club, if you know what I mean.
Right. And I mean, even if Alan Key breaks off, I mean, it's still Skull and Bones.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just like at Yale. I can't remember what the names are, but it's the same process at Yale. In your junior year, you're Skull and Bones. And in your senior year, you graduate into this, whatever it is at Yale. And at University of Utah, it's Skull and Bones to Owl and Key. And they're both considered the most prestigious secret societies on campus.
Right.
You know, and they are secret societies. That's another question that I always get is, well, if they were publishing their names and their pictures in the yearbook, then they're not a secret society because they're telling you, and that's not how secret societies work.
Right.
That's not the secret part of secret societies. Right.
Exactly.
So, yeah. So then sort of just to close this circle, and then we can go to a new topic if you want, it was these members of the fraternities, which you're talking about the Marriotts, right? You're talking about the Huntsmans, you're talking about the Winders, you're talking about the Cannons, you're talking about the Tanners, you're talking about all of the Mormon aristocratic families. Yeah, that's one of my favorites. I love that picture from the Utonian. That's a great one. Yeah, we're not doing anything weird, right?
Right.
We're an academic honors society. That's what you like. Jim Bennett, who's related to the Bennett family, who was one of the most prolific members of these fraternities. I got into a Twitter beef with him before he blocked me about this, and he swears up and down that it was nothing but an honor society. And I think I sent him pictures like this and said, yeah, like I remember when I was in honor societies, we would always dress up in robes and have our scrolls out, right? Like,
right.
So yeah, I mean, it's crazy talk. It's just people who are too lazy to go do the research, right?
Well, and it's kind of like an obfuscation of the truth, right?
Sure. Well, so I mean, it's funny that you mentioned that, because what are secret societies all about? It's an occult organization, and
right.
What does it mean to occult? Something that means to hide it from people. So
right.
you're
hidden knowledge.
Yeah, 1,000% like dead on with that, and that's what they were doing, is that they were occulting things in order to put themselves in positions where they could be successful at the disadvantage of others. Which, right. Again, that's like my major problem with fraternities and sororities is twofold. One, in order to be a part of a fraternity or sorority, you have to engage in what I call shame bonding. Okay.
Right.
And I don't think shame bonding has any part in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Right.
Right.
So for there to be these fraternities and sororities at the University of Utah, and so like I think of it this way. So we have the Sigma Chi ritual, right? And in the Sigma Chi ritual, it talks about them partaking of the Black Sabbath, or the Black Sacrament, right? Excuse me. And so you have to picture this in your head. It's really important to stop thinking about it like theoretically, right? And like realize that like things were happening in space and time. And one of the things that happened in space and time is that you would have a Sigma Chi initiate partaking of the Black Sacrament on a whatever, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, whenever the initiation was. And on Sunday, going and partaking of the Lord's Supper.
Right.
And I have a problem with that. And like, maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know, but I have a problem with it. Like, it's, to me,
it seems counterintuitive.
It's just hugely problematic. And again, to me, it goes to like this idea of trying to serve two masters, right? So in Sigma Chi, Constantine is their patron saint. In the LDS church, they used to talk about the great apostasy. They don't do it anymore because it's mean, and Mormons aren't allowed to be mean anymore. You have to be nice and you have to be a peacemaker, right? Whatever that's all about. But back in the day, they used to talk about the great apostasy. Well, who was responsible for the great apostasy? It was Constantine, who tried to marry church and state to consolidate power, right? So how do you go to a Sigma Chi meeting and venerate Constantine during the week, and on Sunday go to a church and learn about the great apostasy and hold it together without cognitive dissonance, right? And somehow they do it, and they go on to lives of tremendous success. But to me, so like I had the opportunity to join a fraternity. I was at the University of Denver, but when I found out what they wanted to do to me, for me to there's no way I was going to participate in that shame bonding. It just wasn't going to happen, right? And so, I mean, that's problem number one, right? Problem number two is that they're doing things in secret. And again, for me, like as a Christian, I still consider myself a Christian, a disciple of Jesus Christ. One of the things that Christ was very clear about was like, there are mysteries, but if you knock, they shall be opened unto you. If you, whatever, blah, blah, blah. What he says is, I didn't do anything in secret, right? When they try to take him, he says, why are you, I did all this stuff out in the open. Why are you guys giving me a hard time now? Right.
Right.
And so for me, these occult secret societies are really problematic in that they create a system in which there's built-in advantage for a small group of people that consider themselves elites at the expense of those that they consider the unwashed, or the uninitiated is maybe a better way of saying that. Right. So those are the two big problems for me. I don't care if people who aren't members of the church want to play that game. I mean, I guess, but like, to me, anybody that understands the gospel of Jesus Christ should stay millions of miles away from that kind of thing. And it was official church policy to stay away from those things. Prophets, so I can't remember, it's just been too long. But there was a time when there was a stake president who wrote a letter to the prophet of the church saying, look, should we give temple recommends to people who are engaging in these secret societies? And the prophet wrote back and says, we don't recommend that you do. And that lasted until this group that's around the time of Russell M. Nelson, until they got into church leadership. And all of a sudden, church policy changed on the occult, right? And it changed on secret society.
Isn't that interesting?
And so like you can see them utilizing their influence to shift the church in a direction that I would consider towards, like, to go back to what we said earlier, like, I don't think the church can stay in stasis for 250 years. You're either moving towards Zion or you're moving towards apostasy. And I think that this group of people who took control of the church have moved the church towards apostasy. That's just my opinion. Right. And I'm not here to say
I think I agree with that as well. I mean, which is going to trickle down a lot of the horrible things that we see.
Sure.
And I think, because it is a top-down structure.
Sure. Well, and so let's substantiate our claim with some evidence. Okay. So let's talk about so we talked about Rotary International. Greek Living gives you access to Rotary International. It mixes you in with all these people in your city and in your area and in your region who care about commerce and theoretically sometimes religion, right? All religions are equal inside of Rotary International. So, but the next thing that happens is the church gets involved with the American intelligence community. Okay. One of the biggest finds that I've ever made was in the CIA reading room, where there's a document that was labeled as secret, but was eventually published, probably through a FOIA request. And that document states that the CIA went to Brigham Young University to meet with the elders of the church. So you're talking the apostles, right, who all sit on the boards of the church and that kind of thing. There's all kinds of groups that meet up there at BYU. And they wanted to come and discuss recruitment, right? And the church explicitly says that they endorse the mission of the CIA. Okay. Now, this is
so dangerous.
Yeah, right. So this isn't, and it's not a secret.
No,
a lot of people at this point know that the church is overrepresented in the Department of Homeland Security, in the National Security Agency, in the FBI, in the Central Intelligence Agency. And there are some really good, plausible reasons for why that is. But here's my question, okay? So first of all, you're a church. You're a church. Why are you getting in bed with an intelligence agency that we now know has been mostly involved with projects that are designed to remove the agency of human beings through overthrowing governments, through controlling minds, through violent acts, right? And all these things. I do not understand. So Jeffrey Holland was the president of BYU when this happened, and he's now an apostle, of the church. And I just don't understand how you sit in a meeting. Okay, wait, I lied. I do understand, and I'm going to tell you why. I don't understand how you get over the hump on making this decision because you're a church. Okay.
Right.
And getting involved with an organization like that should have had red flags all over it. In fact, in the document that I found, it says the elders of the church are going to go and discuss the problem of what would happen if the members find out, because they know that it would affect the image of the church. Right. So just like Ensign Peak, where they hid the tithing money in shell companies, and they did it so that people wouldn't know that there was so much money. They were also hiding that they were in bed with these intelligence agencies because they knew that it would hurt the image of the church if it were known the extent. I have found over 150 CIA documents that reference the church, going all the way back to the church formally requesting from the Central Intelligence Agency access to IBM equipment at a time when almost nobody had IBM equipment, right? And of course, people know that IBM was highly involved in Nazism, right? That's how the Nazis kept records and could identify who the Jews were, was utilizing IBM equipment. Okay. And so the church was not involved in that, by the way, as far as I can tell. The church didn't get into the IBM game until the 1960s from the documents that I can gather. But they were clearly joined at the hip with especially the CIA, right? Which is just hugely problematic. To me, it's just hugely problematic, right? So the other question about that to me is simply this, if you're going to get in bed with them, once you see what they're doing, why don't you extricate yourself? It's not like knowledge of the CIA's, again, immoral, unethical, and illegal activity is a secret. It hasn't been for over, 50, 60 years, right?
Right.
Is probably when people really got a hold of it. I don't think people knew about Operation Gladio, which the church was highly involved in through David M. Kennedy, right? The president of Continental Illinois and the friend of God's banker. I always say his name wrong, so I'm just going to say his last name, but it's Sindona, right? To the point where David Kennedy got charged by the government of Italy for defrauding a bank. But because he had been the Treasury Secretary, I think they weren't going to get him. And he just got off on a technicality. But the church was highly involved in this laundering of money. Well, okay, wait. That was not the right way to say that. I apologize. Members of the church were very involved in situations that were very clearly operations of the Central Intelligence Agency, which involved the laundering of money. Later on, we know that the church was highly involved in developing torture programs. Okay? At least 2 members of the church, one of whom was a bishop, was responsible for developing the CIA's enhanced interrogation programs.
Right. Torture.
Okay? And yeah, torture. And when that came out, this guy was a bishop and he had to resign his position because it was such a scandal, right? But my question about this is why don't you extricate yourself? The church believes in repentance, right? Like, it's like kind of the whole game. Like, we're all going to make mistakes, but when we learn that we've made mistakes, we fix it.
We repent.
Yeah, but the church has never repented of this. Why? Well, I think it's pretty obvious, because it gives them protection. It gives them access to corridors of power. It gives them access to power, influence, and gain. And that is really heady stuff. We talked about David O. McKay earlier. I called David O. McKay the first jet set apostle, right? And from everything that I can learn about David O. McKay, he was in love with the black limousine. He was in love with being able to go on the cruises. He was in love with the fact that he was friends with Cecil DeMille, right?
So he liked the prestige of being in the position.
Who doesn't? Right? And then here's the real problem, I think, is that in the 1970s, Spencer W. Kimball gets very uneasy about the fact that the church isn't spreading across the world as fast as he would like it to, because part of the prophecies of Mormonism is that the gospel will be preached to all the world. And at this point, it's not. Okay. And this is another reason that I think it's a major reason that they got in bed with the Central Intelligence Agency. So as I thought about this, I thought, what would cause this? And I realized, well, there was common ground here. The CIA really wanted to get rid of communist governments so that democracy could spread. And the LDS Church really wanted to get rid of communist governments so that the gospel could spread. And so I think they found some common ground there, and they just decided to make some quote unquote pragmatic decisions. And it was a marriage of convenience, and it worked. I mean, it worked really well. And Russell Nelson was highly involved in that. He was neck deep, if not more, in Eastern Europe and Russia and all these places. And when you read the history of the missionary programs out there, it's pretty clear that they weren't there to do missionary work at first, right? Then beyond that, they really got onto a good grift. And I'll just tell a really quick story about this. I know that we're already at an hour. But what happened is in Armenia, there was an earthquake. And it was a major earthquake. It killed a lot of people. I don't remember the number, but it killed a lot of people. So what happened is the church immediately, and you'll find this pattern in the church from this point moving forward, they make a very small donation to the government, and they do it through Russell M. Nelson, facilitated by a woman by the name of Beverly Bruff Campbell, who, if anybody's interested in this topic, you have to go read Beverly Bruff Campbell's memoirs, because she drops every name and talks about every event that happened during like a 15 to 20 year period where she was serving as the director of international affairs of the church. So they send Russell Nelson into the country and make a small donation. And while Russell's there, he's a member of Sigma Chi. He's a member of of Allen Key. And he just mentions, hey, there's a lot of destruction here. I know a guy by the name of John Huntsman who runs cement, right? And if you need somebody to rebuild your buildings in a way that's safe for the next earthquake, I'll put you in touch with John Huntsman. The next thing that happens is when John Huntsman gets the contract and brings Ronald Rasband, who's an apostle in the church, over as part of this. But the very first thing that happens when John Huntsman gets there says, hey, it's going to take a lot of people to build these buildings. I just happen to know a guy by the name of Bill Marriott, right? also a member of Sigma Chi, right?
Right.
And he says, we need to build some housing. And so, like, let me put you in touch with Bill. Okay. The next thing that happens is Bill Marriott comes in, and this is like loose, right? Like, this isn't like exactly what happened. It's the idea of what happened. So you get Bill Marriott showing up, and he says, man, it's going to take a lot of food to feed these people. I just happen to know a guy by the name of Don Staley, right? I may be pronouncing that wrong. I don't do great at pronouncing names. Don Staley is the CEO of one of America's largest food distributors. So, like, let me introduce you to Don. And now all of a sudden the church has made a small donation to a country in need. And the aristocracy ends up profiting wildly off that. Okay. Now in Armenia, it gets a little bit weirder because the rumor out there is that the Armenian mafia wanted a piece of the action. And so in order for these guys to profit, they had to get wrapped up in the Armenian mafia. The biggest piece of evidence that I'm aware of that that's the case is that once the church backed out of Armenia, apparently all of the congregations in Armenia went away. It was the fastest, like it just imploded. The church imploded in Armenia.
Wow.
Right. And so what people say is that, like, people who serve missions there and that kind of a thing, right? They say, yeah, like the Armenian mafia was like the backbone of the church in Armenia. And when there was no longer any money to be made, it just collapsed. Right. So, but you'll see this pattern over and over through LDS philanthropies. There's a disaster. The church comes in, makes a small donation. They introduce all of their buddies. Everybody makes a ton of money, and then you back out, right? So that's sort of the game that's getting played in my, like, from my research. That's right. What I would say that the game that's being played there, and it's all through that Greek living organization, right? Through those organizations, right? It's a very clear pipeline to me, at least, right? And I think I hope that I am somewhat intelligent and have the ability to be reasonable about this. I don't want to just like make stuff up, but like when you go back and look at the historical documents, it seems like a very, very clear pipeline to me. And then I think, I'd like to spend just the last little bit talking about how this rolls into abuse, if that's
right.
Okay.
Yeah, of course. I think that's a great way to end it.
Yeah. So here's how this works. Spencer Kibble makes the decision that they're going to get involved with the intelligence agencies. He makes the decision that he's going to bring David Kennedy in to run an organization. He brings in Beverly Bruff Campbell, and these organizations are no longer running under priesthood authority. And that's not me saying that. That's them. These are outside of normal priesthood channels. And I think this is really where the bifurcation of the church and the corporation just leads to terrible consequences, right? It was already bad, but I think this is where it really gets out of hand. And the problem is that it's working from the church's perspective because growth inside the church starts happening. Okay. Not just membership.
So they've placed growth over the actual faith itself.
Over conversion, right? The purpose of the church is to convert people to the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? But it was no longer about that. It was about what are the numbers? Anybody who served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints knows exactly what I'm talking about, right? And it became very bureaucratic, and it became very results oriented, and not the results of conversion, the results of get them in the church, get them to the temple, right? Get them paying tithing, okay? And it was working. It was working beautifully. And I don't impute ill intent to leaders of the church. I think they honestly believe that the Lord was blessing them, just like anybody who preaches prosperity gospel believes that they're being blessed by God, right?
Right.
So I don't blame them for getting excited about this, because if the membership numbers are growing, well, then that's just a sign of God's favor. At the same time, they're drifting further and further away from God's teachings and engaging in, again, like all manner of immoral, unethical, and illegal behavior, right? So where abuse comes into it is all of a sudden these cases start popping up of abuse in the church. And abuse has always been a problem in the church from day one, okay? Right. I mean, a lot of people will say that polygamy was abusive. I mean, certainly Joseph Smith marrying a 14-year-old or a 15-year-old, people can say it was the way that it worked. It's not the way that it worked. If you look at the average age of marriage during that time, it was not 14, okay?
Right.
Or 15, okay? So we don't want to pretend that abuse was ever not present in the church. Abuse is prevalent in the church at about the same rate, we think. We can't get all the numbers because the church refuses to publish the numbers. But based on Floodlit's work, everybody should go check out at Floodlit and maybe at floodlit.org. We should probably look it up.
Yeah.
But they've done just the most incredible job of documenting cases. Okay. And as we look at that and we get a big enough sample size, we believe that abuse happens inside the church at about the same rate as it does inside any large organization. So people will often say, oh, do you think we're worse than others? No, I don't, but I don't think you're any better either. And that's a problem because you think you're better. And the problem is that parents then drop their guard when they walk through the doors of a chapel and they think that their children are safe. And in reality, you're no safer inside the church than you are dropping your child off at a daycare. Okay.
Right.
Nor putting them into a public school. It's all about the same. Any group of large people is going to abuse it about the same rate. That just makes sense. Now that I think about it, at first you want to believe that it's a lot worse because you're angry and you're upset and whatever. But as you do the research, you just learn that it's about the same prevalence as anywhere else. Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Floodlit.org for anyone who's curious, and I'll show their website here in just a sec.
Yeah. You got to check it out if you're interested in this topic. They are, in my opinion, they're the most important thing going on inside of LDS, the LDS abuse research community.
Yeah.
So I would highly encourage people to check it out and to donate to them because they run it on a bare bones staffing and budget. So anyway, so these cases of abuse start popping up, and of course the corporation has a problem because in many of the cases the corporation is liable. Okay, and so obviously it's extremely bad for the brand as the church is growing, right? The last thing you want is your name in the news about abuse. And what happens around the time that President Nelson gets called as an apostle of the church? Well, his daughter gets named as part of a pedophilia ring, and satanic panic, waka, 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 right, becomes a thing, right? And the church knows about this because we know about the Pace memo, and we know that the church was looking into all this stuff, and they knew that it was a problem. But you're trying to get into communist countries. The last thing that you can do as Russell M. Nelson is go to Russia and have the first question that the Russian prime minister or whatever asks you is, why is your daughter abusing children? Right?
Right.
Or why is Satanism a part of Utah culture? And why are people being abused in ritual abuse inside of your state? You just can't have that. And so the church, again, makes this pragmatic decision to just bury it. And Russell Nelson was involved in a major cover-up. Okay. We know that he received abuse cover-up instructions because I've met the guy who delivered those instructions to him. Okay. So it's just a problem of brand and image and protecting the assets, because obviously, as we learned with the Boy Scouts, if you're involved in a ton of abuse cases, it will deplete your reserves very, very, very quickly. Okay.
Right.
So there's this dichotomy of the church externally growing. Their coffers are growing. Membership is growing. Everything's great. I'm a Mormon. Mitt Romney's running for president. It's the Mormon moment. At the same time, the seedy underbelly is all these cases of incest and abuse that the church just has to make sure that it never gets out. Right.
Well, and also if they're filing in members as quickly as they can, there's no discernment.
Sure.
To a lot of this, because
Sure.
I mean, it's at least in theory, it's supposed to be a self-policing organization. It's
Sure.
supposed to be a self-policing church, and yet they don't have that ability because they're just filing in people as quickly as possible. So there's kind of no way for the average member to, look around at their community and be like, I don't know,
Sure.
we need to pay attention and watch that person,
So one of the major controversies is this. We now know that the church has hundreds of billions of dollars, right? And yet it refuses to do background checks when it calls people into positions where they're going to be in contact with the youth, except in Britain, because their law, there was a group of people out there, a group of members that forced the issue. And so here's the problem again for me. Look, guys, you've got all the resources that you need to be the gold. They call themselves the gold standard. They are not the gold standard of abuse prevention or response. They're just not.
Right.
Okay. The gold standard does not feed victims of abuse. into a system that the very first thing that happens is you make a phone call to a group of lawyers and therapists who have severe conflicts of interest and are mostly concerned about protecting the image and assets of the leader that learned about the abuse and the church that may be liable for the abuse. I don't know how they get away with it. I really don't know how they get away with it. The conflict of interest is off the charts with Kurt and McConkie,
right? Yeah,
and the LDS abuse hotline.
It's their lawyers, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So people go to their bishop thinking they're going to get help to recover from abuse, but the very first thing that happens is the leader lawyers up. Okay, that lawyer is not there for the victim at all.
Right.
Okay. Now they'll give advice that they think might help the victim, but that's not the first priority. The first priority is make sure that our leader and the church are not going to expose the corporation to liability. And there's not a person in the world that can convince me otherwise. I sat in on those calls. Okay. I was on a call with Matthew Ballard, Elder Ballard's grandson, when I was a ward clerk. Okay. And I'm not going to go into it too deeply, but like I left feeling gross. I left feeling gross. And it wasn't that he was a bad guy, and things worked out pretty well in that case. But like, even though it worked out pretty well, I still felt gross. So I can only imagine in the bad cases that we've heard about and that we see, like how that feels, right? But in the end, it just shouldn't exist. And if you have hundreds of billions of dollars, I guess getting back to what I was saying is, look, you have the ability and the resources to be the gold standard. And that starts with vetting the people who are in your organization. Okay.
Right.
And if you're the corporation and you're responsible for the interface between the spiritual body and civil society, then one of your first duties is to make sure that your houses of worship are the safest places on the face of this earth.
Right. And they have every ability to do so.
Absolutely. They have the most brilliant, like, look, like Mormons are extremely bright and extremely compassionate and extremely empathetic. Like, and they have every resource that they need to make that happen, but it's just not a priority. Their priority is stuffing money into shell companies, having people sign documents that they haven't read, right? Engaging in illegal behavior that costs them like almost nothing. The church got fined $1 million. Ensign Peak got fined $4 million. They make that in like 10 minutes. Who cares?
Right.
Right. But that's where their priority is. So I say it this way, in my opinion. It's a church. And in the scriptures, we read about the shepherd, right? And the shepherd's job is to take care of the sheep at any cost.
Right.
And what I fear is that the corporation has drifted away from being the shepherd of its flock. And instead, they're very worried about the pasture, right? They're very worried about the barns.
Right.
They're very worried about like whether they have the right tools. They're very worried about anything and everything. And if a few of the flock get picked off, well, so be it. It's the cost of doing business.
Right. You know, gotta bust a couple of eggs to make an omelet.
Yeah. And so, I mean, you see this all the time, like where, I mean, like, I can't tell you the number of victims that I have spoken to that have written heart-wrenching letters to the leadership of the church only to be told that nothing's going to happen. And those leaders don't care if that person walks away. They don't go after the one. They had that whole 99 and 1 campaign when President Nelson, they don't go after the one. They don't.
Right.
I've been excommunicated for 2 years. I've met with my stake president once in those 2 years. They have no interest in bringing me back into the fold. I am a lost sheep, like that will never be found. Yeah. Even though I'm like at the gate, like bleeding, like blah, let me in, blah, like, and they're just like, nope, not going to happen.
Which, you know, for somebody like you said at the beginning, would most likely still be a member. That says to me, like, if I were in that position, it would just sound like, oh, great, so there's no redemption.
Sure. Well, and so and here's the last thing I'll say about it, and then I'll let you sort of wrap us up here. So here's the problem for me. Anytime a church demands fealty to another man, it becomes very problematic in my world. Right. Because a church is not about anybody being between myself and my Savior and my King, right? And so, unfortunately, in the church, as this group of people has come into power, they have changed the definition of apostasy. And in order to get baptized, you have to declare fealty to the brethren. You have to say that you're going to sustain them. And of course, they can't define what sustaining means. I spent 2 years trying to get them to give me a definition of what sustaining means. And they won't, because then they would be held accountable.
Yeah.
Right.
And then they're backed into a corner.
Right. And that's the last, like Kurt and McConkie, like if the corporation runs the church, Kurt and McConkie runs the corporation. Right. And so the last thing they're going to do is get backed into a corner. Right. So they're very slippery. Like, they're great lawyers, amazing lawyers. Like, congratulations, guys. Good job.
Yeah.
But that's a huge problem for me. Like, I'll never be able to join the church because I'm going to publish the truth about the brethren. And the truth is, a lot of them engage in very questionable behavior, and they have no right to go out and say that they should be trusted completely. It's just false doctrine, and they should never say it. And so I'm just never going to have that opportunity because I refuse to shut my mouth and bow down to these men. It's just never going to happen.
To the leadership that's clearly compromised,
in my opinion.
Yeah. And I would have to second that opinion. I mean, that's, especially living here in the state of Utah. I mean, it's all around. I mean, you can see it. That's, one of the big reasons why I left the church. The first time I tried to go back at one point and tried to, as an adult, kind of try and be a part of the church later on. And that didn't last long because of the problems I saw. So yeah, I can definitely second that opinion.
Yeah. So, I mean, if it works for you, like I said, I don't ever encourage people to leave, especially if you grew up in the church.
Right.
I cannot tell you the psychological trauma.
Right.
Sorry. That comes from having your support system and your understanding of the world, your worldview, ripped out from under you. It is unbelievably traumatic and disorienting. And like, whether you choose to leave or whether you get kicked out, that's going to occur. And I don't want anybody to go through that. So if it works for you, I don't think there's anything wrong with staying and just doing your best. And I talk to so many people who understand the problems, but just say, like, I love the gospel and I'm just going to do my best to like be in the church. And I respect that. And I love them for the decisions they made. Like, we all have our flavor of crazy. And if your flavor of crazy is Mormonism, like, more power to you. It's no crazier than Catholicism or any other, like Buddhism, right? Islam. It's just different flavors of crazy when you look at it. Right.
Right.
So, and that doesn't mean it's not true either. Like, just because our minds can't wrap around like the symbolism of what we learn and the things that we do, it has no bearing on whether it's true, but like, to our mortal minds, it's just different flavors of crazy.
Right. Right. And I would have to agree with that. But on that note, I think we'll get you out of here. I know you've had a long week.
Yeah.
And I think that's a perfect place to end it. Leave everyone wanting just a little bit more. So that way we can get you back and dive into some of this stuff a little bit more to give people a little bit better of an understanding. But on that, do you want to let everyone know where they can find you?
Yep. Just at LDS Abuse on X. And it is the only place that I spend time. So if you want to get a hold of me, I'm very easy to find, and you can DM me and I'm happy to talk to you. And have a lot of people call and a lot of people email. And I love the conversation. So I would encourage people to reach out if they'd like to. Yeah.
So definitely make sure and go check out his page. He has a lot of amazing work. One of the people that I make sure and have notifications on for, I'm always going back through his back catalog and all sorts of things. So highly recommended. Honestly, I'll even say, if you don't have a Twitter account, just sign up just so you can go on and go check out his page, because there is so much great information out there that's actually rather difficult to find if you don't know exactly what you're looking for. Unfortunately, it's kind of hard to find on there. I spew a lot, so I apologize for that. For those of you who have to try to go through it, it's like 20,000 tweets at this point. So thank you. That was very, very kind of you. I appreciate that. Yes, of course. And I definitely mean every word of it. So, and then on that note, anyone that would like to support what I have going on, there's a couple of ways to be able to do this. You can head on over to Ko-Fi, ko-fi.com/rise to liberty. And you can go check that out. You can give a one-time donation or a monthly donation. You can also go do the same thing over at Buy Me a Coffee. Not sure why that website went that way. Always with these damn websites. There we go. You can head on over to Buy Me a Coffee. I definitely need as much caffeine as possible to keep this show going. And that's about the only vice I have these days between that and nicotine, and those are numbered, I'm sure. So, but if you want something a little bit more substantial instead of just donating money, you can head on over to risetoliberty.store and you can go check out some t-shirts that I have. I've got some great mind control designs, mugs, bottles, t-shirts, got long sleeves and hoodies, because it's starting to get cold. So go check that out. The last place I will recommend anyone to go check out is my Substack, which is actually called Beware the Mockingbird. So it's kind of a play on Operation Mockingbird. It's something I think we should all be aware of. So go check that out. I have actually a few different things about LDS abuse on my Substack, and there's actually more coming. So you'll find actually this interview get put up over there. So, and on that, I'll give the last word to you, Justin, if you have anything else for anybody.
I just want to thank you. I'm a small channel. I'm about to hit 3,000 followers. And I'm just so thankful anytime anybody's willing to let me come on and tell this story. Again, I don't want to represent that everything I've said here tonight is the truth, right? But I think that we bring some value to the conversation, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to hopefully get people's minds working and encourage them to get out there. And we live in difficult times, and it's in times where we can't trust others. And so we have to be independent in the information that we gather and decide to govern our lives by. So I hope that people find value in the research that I do, and I hope they can make better decisions utilizing what we put out there. And so, yeah, just thank you so much for the opportunity to continue to spread the word.
Yeah, of course, anytime. And we'll definitely get you back. I'll have something a little bit more rigid, see what the community says and see if they have any questions or anything, and start diving into this, because we just scratched the surface.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. So, hours and hours more. So if people want me back, I'll come back.
Right on. That sounds perfect. All right. Make sure to hit the like, share, subscribe, all of those things on the way out. And until next time, stay free, my friends.